Jake is with skills in workforce development on LinkedIn, leading for North America. LinkedIn is one of the largest platforms and communities for employees. So excited for Matt to sit down with him and ask a few questions.
Yeah, thank you for coming, Jake.
My pleasure.
So tell me about what you do at LinkedIn.
It's sort of a fun gig. It was created over 6.5 years of evolving, starting in higher ed and then eventually getting into workforce development as we think about how to change the relationship that LinkedIn has with governments. Interestingly, a lot of companies of sort of Microsoft scale, our parent company, have already figured out public-private partnerships, much in the way that decades ago we thought about infrastructure in terms of bridges. Now they're thinking about them in terms of education, et cetera. And yet LinkedIn hadn't gone there. We sold SKUs. We sell licenses at scale, but there's still often, for instance, for a government to hire their own employees. And so much of the past few years has been how do we figure out a more symbiotic relationship with governments wherein we actually can power their public services using everything from our job matching to the labor market information we'll talk about today.
Great. And we had a fascinating conversation last week about the Great Resignation. First, what does LinkedIn's data say about the Great Resignation and how it's different in different geographies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last point is the key one. It's so different in Canada than the U.S., and so many folks think of us, I think justifiably, as a 51st state, that it shows the fact that this sort of mass change in labor markets is actually quite unique to different geographies. So as an example, in the States there was a Great Resignation and it was actually really focused on certain segments within the population, whereas within Canada we actually maintained higher levels of employment than we did pre-pandemic, and in part that was because the government was sort of pumping subsidies into companies to keep people hired. But it was also in part because the sense of one's sort of purpose or association of values with one's job would seem, even amongst sort of first-line workers in Canada, to be greater. People identify more with their jobs than in many cases in the US. And the result was that folks weren't leaving those jobs at the same scale. We had a bit of a great reshuffle, but what I sort of found amazing was the language was even different. The headlines were, "There's no great resignation," and then I thought some of the more subtle writing was about the great realization, about often instead of folks at sort of the first-line worker level thinking about, okay, I really don't want to go back to that job that doesn't have a career pathway or any growth or any emotional value to me. In Canada, often in Europe, and even in some parts of the developing world, we often saw the professional classes, the white-collar classes, really looking at themselves and saying, maybe this isn't the job I want. I don't want to be spending this many hours working, or I'm not creating the kind of value I want. Often spending time with their families and really rediscovering, in my case, I'm embarrassed to say, it was a connection to a dog and nature that taught me how to love again. And it's embarrassing to say it, but my fiance honestly looks at me. We split up pre-pandemic. We were engaged, we were gonna get married, and then we got re-engaged during the pandemic, in part because of that realization.
Does your data tell you anything about why people in Canada have a greater sense of purpose related to their jobs? And also, when we talked last week, you used the word purpose, which really got my attention, because that is, what I've talked about how we want to unlock human potential. Ultimately, you can't fully unlock human potential unless people have a sense of purpose, right? Once they have their daily bread or the opportunity to get their daily bread in one way or another. But the other word you used was despair.
Yeah, it's maybe the opposite of purpose, right? In this specific context, not sort of literally, but metaphorically, the reason I think so many folks are changing jobs or aren't going back to work is because they no longer have the hope associated with purpose. They no longer have the meaning or the drive, the motivation that your mother had when you immigrated here, that my mother had when she was a refugee immigrating to Canada. That was a drive to sort of create a better life with some idea of the pathway to get there. And often that's directly associated either with education and or with your employer. And what's happened, I think, in many cases is people have lost that connection. The way we studied it was sort of simple in retrospect. It was look at the values that an individual has, look at the things that they explicitly say are important to them, and then look at the values that a company espouses. And to the extent that they are aligned, we found that in almost every metric, literally across every single metric, the companies did better and the employees did better. So if, for instance, I care a lot about the fact that LinkedIn gets people jobs and is more about getting people jobs than it is about making money, then I will spend more time working for LinkedIn, customers will buy more for LinkedIn, LinkedIn will grow faster, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the interesting things here is I think that we can begin to think about employment not just about salaries, not just based on even how frequently one changes positions or roles, et cetera, but rather in terms of the emotional association that one has with a job, and then figure out appropriate means of measuring that. And the last thing I'll say here, because I know this is a long answer, is we briefly talked about assessment. And I think assessment of these human, maybe not skills, but rather values, is perhaps the most difficult but important challenge, because as we move away from sort of a industrial type economy to one that's really about human interaction, where the production is coming from our brains, what we often miss is how much of that is associated with emotions. And to the extent that companies, that organizations can tap into those emotions, we're actually seeing those companies are more productive.
So as a former academic, I actually feel that that answer was way too short because it was so rich and interesting. So how does one go about measuring values in a rigorous way and finding that degree of alignment between the employee and the company? And also, what does a bad company values statement look like?
I wish I remember reading the answers to these questions, and the academic in me is saying I don't know the actual answers to these questions, so I might not go for very long on this one, but rather I think at the highest level, it was a relatively explicit exercise. Okay, what is it that you value, like a survey? I think there's all sorts of statistical methods of ensuring that surveys are rigorous, but then to have a similar, A, very large, we're talking tens of thousands of companies, hundreds of thousands of employees, and B, a survey that, again, was rigorous in the sense of not having a hypothesis at the outset. Our goal at the outset was to figure out whether there was alignment between values and the purpose of a company, not what that meant for the company, and then we sort of ran all of the ways that we measure companies and people's satisfaction with companies, as we do for a variety of other LinkedIn surveys that have been done for 15 years now. And so the conclusions in this case, I think, were quite surprising, much in the way that we would hope science, so to speak, could come up with evidence. There was a really interesting one that happened today, and it's loosely related, but everybody's obsessed with skills right now. And for the longest time, I've been pushing LinkedIn to become more of a skills-based hiring and learning platform, but also to question whether that's more equitable. Because I don't think there's a lot of evidence yet. There's increasing numbers of articles out in Forbes, et cetera, on how skills-based hiring and learning is going to create equity. I'm not so sure. Honestly, I think there's a lot of reasons it could go the opposite direction. But today what we found was by helping people identify, so i.e. when they're searching for a job on LinkedIn and there's a pop-up that says, hey, you actually might have the same skills that this job has and not know it, that actually gets more women to apply for those jobs than men. And we've really struggled with that on LinkedIn because, generally speaking, the degree of proactivity sort of necessary on LinkedIn is often favors men, and sort of the overconfidence, one could even argue, that men have in applying for jobs relative to women. And so figuring out how those minor changes to our platform, in the sense of it didn't require a huge amount of product development, but massive changes in terms of the ethical impact, I think will allow us to sort of answer some of those questions about skills and even values alignment as well.
So the study did not illuminate you about what bad values at the corporate level look like.
Yeah, interestingly, it was the alignment between the values and the employees. And I think that's actually a key conclusion, which is that the companies have to figure out what their employees want the company to be doing. And in some ways, that's sort of flipping the model. Usually values are pretty top-down, right? You have leadership say, this is where we want to go, this is why, join us or not. And that, I think, is going to change, much as there's this huge movement away from institutions and towards individuals. Everybody, if LinkedIn is talking about the creator economy, everybody's talking about the creator economy. But that also, I think, has implications for the fact that those individuals are being empowered, not just with economic resources or influence over where the company is going to go in terms of production, but also purpose and values.
I hope you're right. I have a sort of personal speculation about the California bill that was defeated that would have required Uber and Lyft and Instacart to recognize employees who worked for more than 20 hours a week as full-time employees and to give them benefits. And those companies fought it tooth and nail. And I guess what I wonder is if they had just agreed not to fight that bill and those workers had become full-time employees, I wonder if their employee churn problem would have ameliorated and whether they would have made more money than by treating workers as interchangeable objects to be used and discarded.
I think that's absolutely right. I was interviewing Ontario, where I'm based, Minister of Labor, who enacted a law that was sort of 2/3 of the way to the California law, really gave individuals in the gig economy all of the rights, but not the title of employee. And it's interesting because we have quite a conservative and populist government in Toronto right now. So that was sort of a very radical move for the government to make. And in part, I think it was to counteract some sort of pushes in the other direction vis-a-vis employee rights and worker rights. But the interesting thing in terms of what's happened to, for instance, pricing or availability of Uber in Toronto and Ontario right now is it's really gone back to what it looked like before these were sort of major forces in the economy. They have become like another taxi service in the city with easier access via app and more options, et cetera. But the taxis are actually seeing a huge return to folks using them because now we actually have something that's closer to, I think, what's a sort of a real market, the way that markets are supposed to create competition, et cetera. And what you were describing in essence was sort of the externalization of a lot of the challenges that worker rights create for the rest of society. And so now that they're being pulled back into those companies, now that Uber and Lyft have to take on some of those costs, the market looks a little bit more reasonable. And maybe the last thing I'll say on this, because it's sort of a concept I'm super excited about, was when we discovered that equity aspect of skills today, the thing that I put into our team's chat was product society fit. And I mentioned this last week. It's a term that increasingly is being bandied about at LinkedIn, but I think it's so important for us to get away from product market fit because for the longest time we built products exclusively for markets. And what we're realizing now is markets are made up of people, and the important part is to ensure that those people are satisfied with what the market and society looks like. So if we can think a little bit bigger there, then maybe we'll get away from some of the sort of oversimplification of ESG or CSR and right closer into sort of what an impactful investment, for instance, looks like.
So LinkedIn has always been stronger with white-collar workers than with what you're calling first-line workers?
First line, exactly.
First-line workers, as opposed to
we might have stolen it from
frontline
Satya,
or
I'm not sure.
Yeah, what was the origin of the decision to call them first-line workers?
I might be getting this wrong, but if I remember correctly, it did come from Microsoft. So when Microsoft acquired us, eventually we went from frontline to first-line work. And I think some of that might actually have been how Microsoft interacts with knowledge workers versus first-line workers, as opposed to how LinkedIn was much more divided between white-collar and the rest. But I could not be more excited about the fact that on LinkedIn right now, the growth rate in terms of first-line workers in the US, I think, is double the rest. Construction and healthcare are our two largest fields. And in some ways, I'm the anti-LinkedIner. I think our data should be open. I think our platform should be interoperable. There's all sorts of aspects of how LinkedIn works that I think are not good for society. But, and I don't say that too publicly, obviously.
Chatham House rules.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have a job. But in this respect, I think we're doing it right, which is to say we are democratizing some aspects of the data that's most important to first-line workers. So for instance, there's this thing that most people in the room probably have not heard of, but it's called the National Labor Exchange. And the National Association of State Workforce Agencies came up with an agreement wherein every state basically takes every public job board and builds an API to this one group that LinkedIn has the same software connection to, that Indeed and half a dozen other Burning Glass all have software connections to, and the result is that we all know the same things about jobs. And that results in us competing not on who has access to a walled garden of data, but rather on who's able to use that data to create the greatest impact for society.
Why do you think LinkedIn is doing better with first-line workers than it used to? What is attracting them onto the platform?
It's been a really conscious focus. I don't think it would have happened organically. And in my world, it's actually happened so fast and so powerfully that I'm now trying to correct for what I think has been a move from the public sector to private job matching as a result of how successful we've been. Where, again, a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to empower government with our software so that, for instance, there are more people with their hand up saying I'm unemployed who are first-line workers on LinkedIn right now than are accessing the entire public workforce system in America. And that's a problem because that public workforce system provides all the other social determinants of their employment success that a tech platform doesn't help with. So there's a problem there. But the reason in part we've been successful is because we have focused specifically on how to change our platform to make it feel inclusive to those who didn't identify with it before. Third grade language is sort of the basic. So we don't use words that somebody who doesn't have has under a third grade English language capacity, which I thought was very relevant to what Kate was saying. But that was the beginning step. And then from there, we began to look at where else folks who came from first-line backgrounds were sort of dropping off the flow. So the simplest answer is you don't prompt somebody to say, where did you get your high school certificate? Where did you get your undergraduate degree? Because the vast majority of these workers don't have either. The other side, and this has been the more interesting experiment for me because I've sort of been able to be a part of it, is we've created a bunch of break rooms. We started out sort of with folks who are literally stereotypical retail workers at a often food chain, McDonald's, et cetera, and invited them to a group, those who are already on the platform, to have conversations about what was working and what wasn't working at work, about how they could sort of help each other. And often it's just sharing horror stories about how they're being treated by, you know, either their bosses or folks who are buying from them, et cetera. And that sort of sharing of horror stories was creating the emotional connection to LinkedIn that I guess we were talking about before, you know, is very important for people to their employers. And so more and more now, instead of just having one break room, I think we've got a dozen or something with tens of thousands of people participating in them, and we keep tweaking how people engage on them. So sometimes elevating the folks who are providing helpful tips and saying, hey, would you like to do so in a more formal capacity and sort of start the conversations around these? I worry when I push this too hard because I worry about how social media has infected our minds with this sort of need for more engagement. I am hyper addicted to all sorts of social media in ways that I know have sort of made my real world life less, I think, emotionally rewarding. But I also think if we can help folks in their jobs through this kind of sort of loose behavioral economics and nudging, then there could be some positive of that engagement as well.
How do corporations feel about the break rooms, which are just a fascinating experiment? It's basically sort of active Marxism.
That's a great question. I wonder, the active Marxism thing makes me think of labor. Like when you talked about the themes for today, I was super excited because I've spent a fair bit of time thinking about immigration and then labor, unions, et cetera, socialism. I definitely don't think LinkedIn was going for active Marxism. It's a pretty capitalist organization. And I don't think we were intentionally trying to encourage folks to unionize or even to sort of gather in that manner. Rather, it was more to give a voice. But as I answer the question, they sound pretty similar. So I think you're right. It's quite possible that we'll get to a point where we are, in essence, pitting our members against our largest clients. And it'll be interesting to see what happens at that point. But again, let's keep that off the record for now.
Fascinating. I mean, you could end up with a sort of blackmail-based business model where they pay you not to have break rooms. But
well, maybe actually let's dwell on that comment for a quick second, because it's the hardest thing we've had to do is figure out how to get into the demographics game beyond just gender and jobs. And the reason I say that is because we really wanted folks to be able to self-identify based on race, based on a variety of other disability, et cetera. And that's hyper important for hiring in a variety of ways. But it's really hard to allow people to self-identify and then, for instance, hire folks from that background without allowing them to discriminate based on that background. And so, for instance, there are experiments being done right now where we allow folks to hire people who have left the criminal system, formerly incarcerated individuals, and specifically highlight those individuals at the top of the list. So when you're running a recruiter search and an applicant tracking system, right at the top you get all the folks who were formerly incarcerated. And we've had to monitor it, basically. The only way, again, off the record, to ensure that there wasn't discrimination based on the same thing was monitoring, which probably isn't possible at the scale of, monitoring a break room kind of thing. So it's an open question on how to help, for instance, hirers hire based on factors that we know are necessary at this point in order to correct for equality while not discriminating.
Suppose that you didn't have to worry about angry responses from large corporate clients, and you could do whatever you wanted with the break rooms. How would you use them to preserve American democracy and to lift up first-line workers?
Bit of a leading question, particularly the first part, but
Is this a hypothetical?
As somebody who thinks about American democracy a bizarre amount, I think in part because of the distance from being in Canada. I went to high school in America where sort of the idea of America's history and democracy was really important, at least in my education. And so I spent a fair bit of time thinking about, even when I was first in undergrad, there was a famous Québécois movie that came out called Le Déclin de l'Empire Américain, The Decline of the American Empire. And these days that's being sort of talked about more and more and more, but what's amazing is, you're right, it's so concentrated in this one population, which is a big chunk of America in a way that it isn't the rest of the developing world, that I think that it does offer the opportunity to bring people together in the is it Bowling for Columbine sort of sense, the Robert Putnam sense of, if America has lost so many of its civic institutions, maybe there's another opportunity for public-private partnership there. Maybe there's another opportunity to help corporations build their own communities. Maybe not replace churches, but partner with churches. Maybe not replace nonprofits, the YMCA or their local community center, but rather to partner with them so that they are actually strengthening those institutions and the communities that they keep together. Because I think it's very clear that platforms like ours, again, off the record, have done the opposite to date, have increased polarization. There is the potential for tech to do better, not just worse.
Thank you so much for being open and vulnerable. I wish we'd had a chance to talk more about your own connection to immigration. You said you sponsored a number of immigrants?
Yeah, so in Canada we have a quite unique system where there's private sponsorship of refugees, and it's become much more important recently because of the volumes coming into our country. So we had 50,000 Syrian refugees basically overnight arrive, the vast majority of whom were either government-sponsored in the case of people who didn't necessarily have the skills to integrate into society, or privately sponsored where they did. And so my mom, as I said, was a refugee a while ago, 60-some years ago. And when I was a child, they sponsored boat people from sort of Vietnam and Laos. And so I sort of had folks around us all the time, and we grew up all over the world. So my dad was a diplomat. It became a bit sort of natural to have folks from very different classes, very different backgrounds, et cetera, with different opportunities ahead of them in our community. And so it became much more natural when, as an adult, we had the opportunity to sponsor first a Syrian refugee family. In the past 10 years, there's been 4 families from different parts of the world that we've sponsored. And the monetary consequences are minimal, right? Like maybe it's 10, 15, 20K. That sometimes we had a group of 20 people, so everybody was throwing in a few $100 plus external donors. The real challenge, though, and the ongoing challenge, is that these individuals need an emotional connection to society, almost like a parent. And I'm actually sort of curious if you all had that help, because it sounded like in some ways you did it on your own, and even sort of with much more adversity than the families that I'm describing. And so I think that's very admirable and challenging, and the hard work that Andre was describing was remarkable in that way, because some of the families that we've sponsored have not had that connection even to our community, or it's broken down. And as an example, there's one from Syria that is actually actively contemplating going back to Syria.